Arnold Eisen, one of the world's foremost authorities on American Judaism, is the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Since 2007, he has transformed the education of religious, pedagogical, professional, and lay leaders for conservative Judaism and for what he calls the vital religious center of North American Jewry. His philosophy of Jewish learning, leadership, and vision has enhanced the reputation and the global impact of JTS. He's brought the immense learning that has always existed at JTS to bear not only on classical sources and ideas, but also the pressing needs of the contemporary Jewish community. And he's expanded many of the digitalization and online accessibility of historic and contemporary seminary resources. Working in the area of religious thought and the sociology of religion, Arnie is an award-winning writer of 5 books: The Chosen People in America, Galut, Modern Jewish Reflections on Homelessness and Homecoming, Rethinking Modern Judaism, all of which are more academic. The Jew Within, Self, Family, and Community in America, which is a very accessible book about issues that we see more and more in Canada as well. And Taking Hold of Torah, Jewish Commitment and Community in America. It's a very personal essay, and that's the book that's available afterwards for sale. It is the most accessible of all of his academic writing. Before coming to JTS, Dr. Eisen taught at Stanford University, Tel Aviv University, and Columbia University. A native of Philadelphia, his advanced degrees are from Oxford and the Hebrew University. And Arnie has a rare ability to discuss religious thought and behavior at the most abstract level, and then to bring it down to the personal, the practical, and the immediate. And it's a pleasure to have you as our guest tonight. Thank you. David Bezmozgis, Russian film, is an award-winning writer and filmmaker. David's stories have appeared in numerous notable publications. His first book, Natasha and Other Stories, portraying life among Soviet Jewish immigrants in the Bathurst Steeles area of Toronto, was published 10 years ago. It has been translated into 15 languages. Natasha was an amazing breakthrough collection and the winner of many prizes. David has appeared at the New Yorker Festival, the Arm & Hammer Museum at UCLA, the Luminato Festival. His work has been broadcast on NPR, National Public Radio, BBC, and the CBC. And his stories have been anthologized in the Best American Short Stories. The luminescence, insight, and directness of David's language and his writing have now been widely recognized. He was included in the New Yorker's list of 20 writers under 40 a few years ago, because I think you've now hit the... And he has been a Guggenheim Fellow, a McDowell Fellow, a Cullman Fellow at the New York Public Library, where his place of work overlooked that beautiful Bryant Park, and a Radcliffe Fellow. David works in many creative genres. He was a screenwriting fellow at the Sundance Labs, where he developed his first feature, Victoria Day. The film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival and received a Genie Award nomination. This past summer, David directed a film production of Natasha, that is, of the short story Natasha, while juggling at the same time the birth of his third daughter and the release of his new novel. The Free World was David's first novel, and it was a New York Times notable book and a Golden Mail Best Book. It also won the Amazon First Novel Award, even though Amazon, as some of you know, doesn't yet in the United States carry his work. It has to do with a little... This book, right. It has to do with a little conflict with Hachette, the ultimate publisher. And that novel was shortlisted for the Governor General's Award, the Trillium Prize, and the Scotiabank Giller Prize. And his new work, The Betrayers, has been widely acclaimed, and just today was shortlisted for the Scotia Giller Prize. We're pleased as well to welcome his wife Hannah and his mother Sonia, Ashrei Yoladati, which means in Hebrew, blessed are you who gave birth to this wonderful, wonderful soul. David is a modest, serious, and exceptionally thoughtful individual, as well as a great writer. Rabbi Splansky is now the senior rabbi of Holy Blossom Temple, where she began her rabbinic career in 1998 after ordination from Hebrew Union College. She has served Holy Blossom as an assistant rabbi, concentrating on youth and young families, and then as its associate rabbi for 13 years. A fourth-generation Reform rabbi with roots in Europe, Chicago, and Boston. Rabbi Splansky completed her undergraduate studies at Indiana University and at the Hebrew University. A past chair of the Reform Rabbis of Greater Toronto, she's the editor of the new prayer book used at Holy Blossom, Sidur Pirchei Kodesh, author of the Union for Reform Judaism's Reform Voices of Torah, 2012 commentary on Deuteronomy, and a monthly contributor to the Canadian Jewish News. Her husband, Professor Adam Saul, is an award-winning poet, a good acquaintance of David's, and together they raised their 3 sons. She is and will be an important voice in our community and within Reform Judaism. And we are delighted that she has agreed to moderate the dialogue between Arnold Eisen and David Bezmozgis. So what are you doing here? The future of Jewish life and culture in the diaspora.
Yeah? Okay. So kol hakavod to you who have come out. These are very precious days of recovering from the High Holy Days and preparing for Sukkot. So it's already tells us the future of Canadian Jewry is bright, that you would come out on such a night as this for this conversation. Let's jump right in with something controversial. David has said and even puts in writing, the Jewish past is in Europe, the Jewish future is in Israel. So where is North American Jewry in the equation? Neither the past nor the future.
Am I to elaborate on that? Sure. So I was born in the former Soviet Union in Latvia. And my understanding of the Jewish past, as I think it is for a lot of people, is the Ashkenazi Jewish past. I mean, there's also a Sephardic Jewish past. But I think predominantly in North America, the Jews are of Ashkenazi Russian background, broadly, crudely speaking. And I think we all recognize that that community is basically come to an end. Anybody who tours the former lands of the Soviet Union, whether it's Ukraine or Russia or Poland, doesn't encounter a great many Jews, but typically visits a lot of cemeteries. Certainly my experience when I go back there. And I think we have to recognize that our understanding of what, conventionally what Judaism meant, or Jewishness meant, is something that doesn't exist anymore. It was a type of shtetl, Yiddish language Judaism that, to all extents and purposes, is gone. And as far as what the future is, I think it's long been a question, and the question raised by Zionists, one of assimilation. I mean, when Israel was founded, it was founded for two reasons. One is to provide a home for Jews who were persecuted, and two, to provide a place for Jews with a fear of basically assimilation and deracination. I think the question of persecution, all the Jews who were persecuted basically left for Israel or other places. And as far as the Jews who are in North America, I think the question of assimilation persists. I also think that in order for a community to thrive and survive, there has to be something that is forward-looking, and that there's something distinctive. To my mind, one answer to that is religion, absolutely. Though I think we also recognize that most North American Jews are secular. And if they attend synagogue at all, they attended when we did the last couple days. And so you have to ask what the future of this community is, what makes them distinct, and what enables them to perpetuate themselves into the next generation. My answer to that is, if you're a religious person, the answer is quite simple. If you're a secular person, I think the answer is more complicated, and to my mind, it has to do with the Hebrew language. I'm not a religious person. I'm a secular person. I don't believe in God. I respect the traditions. But for me, I believe that Judaism and Jewishness is a rich tradition, rich culture that has, survived for thousands of years, and I would hate for it to disappear. But in order for it to, continue, I think more than anything for secular people, either it's the Hebrew language or I don't know what it is. And for that to happen, I think it also has to do with the future of Israel, which is if Israel remains a secular and democratic state, I think most North American Jews will identify with it. These are mostly humanist people. If it changes tack and becomes a theocratic and, let's say less democratic state, totalitarian state in some fashion, which I hope doesn't happen, I think you're going to lose, as we are losing, a lot of the young generation of Jews. So that's my idea. If Israel continues and retains its secular and Jewish culture, I think you'll be able to attract a future generation of North American Jews. If it doesn't, I have no idea how that continues, unless there's a return to religion, but I highly doubt that's going to happen too.
So David put his finger on the two elements of the answer to Ayel's question. One is we have to talk about our relationship to Israel. And the other is we have to talk about the relationship between religion and the rest of our lives. So as a professor of modern Jewish thought, as a person who has spent his whole adult life moving back and forth between the diaspora and Israel, I was very partial to the notion that there are two Jewish centers in the world. It was a notion put forward by a great Jewish historian named Rabbi Dovich, who wrote a book called Bavel v'Yerushalayim, arguing that there was Babylon and there was the land of Israel, and that has always been true. And it was a polemic against those who said that Israel was the center of the Jewish world. And then one day, I was in Jerusalem in the Cinematheque, and this must have been in the 80s. Some people remember the exact year because I'm going to talk about a film. A film came out called Biglal HaMilchama Hahi, because of that war, which is about a musician named Yehuda Poliker. Remember what year it was? Late 80s? 90? Yehuda Poliker and his partner, both of whom were Holocaust survivors, and the movie was about how their music, which was intense Israeli rock music at the top of the charts, had been thoroughly permeated by the Holocaust. And the lights came on, and I remember this like it was yesterday. I didn't think, my immediate response was, Israel is the center of the Jewish world right now, and I thank God that I'm able to see this movie without subtitles. That was my initial reaction, my unthinking, instinctive reaction. As if, okay, there's a Jewish people, and it has a history, and one major chapter in that history came to an end with the Holocaust, and another major chapter in that history, which concerns the entire Jewish people, is taking place right now in Israel. It doesn't mean that we're irrelevant here. We're not nothing, we're very important. But there are many diasporas, and there's one Israel. There have always been many diasporas, and there's always been one Israel. And so it's a different thing that the entire Jewish people pretty much gets together only in Israel. And even on the human level, where do the leaders of the Jewish people, the heads of the JTSs around the world, where do we get together? Only in Israel. Jewish leaders from around the world tend to meet only in Israel. And so there is this problematic notion that there is a center for the Jewish people, and we pray about it, and we focus on it, and we worry about it, and we feel guilty about it, and we feel responsible for it, and yet we're not there. And we have to build a rich Jewish life where we are. We can't have the only rich Jewish life being lived somewhere else. You can't live vicariously as a Jew and hope to survive. That doesn't work. So we've got to find a way to have a rich Jewish life here. Now that raises the question, which is an open question, but can we do this? And I was really struck when Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who was more my teacher than any other Jewish thinker of the 20th century, pronounced that modern Western Judaism and modern American Judaism especially are an experiment. An experiment. An experiment which may fail because we're trying to do something that, truth be told, Jews have never really done before. We're trying to live in two civilizations at the same time, which is what conservative Judaism is always about. We want to be firmly rooted in Judaism, not just in a superficial way, but firmly rooted in it. This is what I call the vital religious center. Whether you're a serious Reform Jew, a conservative Jew, Orthodox Jew, or a serious Jew who doesn't want to call himself religious but secular, your life has to be thickly Jewish in some way, but also you're really a part of the culture, and you want to do both, and you're pulled, and you're stretched, and there are only so many hours in the day. And so Heschel was raising the very real question about whether we could do this, because, truth be told, Jews have survived for many, many centuries not being part in the same way of the larger cultures. They were residents of someone else's country. And maybe they had non-Jewish friends, but in most places not. And maybe they had non-Jewish business partners. And rarely did they go to non-Jewish schools. And almost never did they marry non-Jews. And so we're trying to do something that hasn't been done before. And I think it's absolutely wonderful. I love the Jewish life we can have here. It's absolutely wonderful if you take advantage of it. But will we make it? Will anybody but the Haredim, those who set themselves apart from the larger society, be here to tell a tale? Well, I'm willing to bet that we will be. Not in large numbers, but we will be. And that's the question for our day. And can we make it? Can we make it as a Jewish community without these walls that religion has put up for us in the past? And if I could just say, you know what, I'll save my comments for that. I'll let you interject here.
Well, I would just say, it's not a question of can we make it. I think in the kind of near term, for a generation or two, we might. But I think we have to talk about how do we make it, if we believe that it's worth doing. So we're now having this conversation at a very particular moment. I think I'm 40 years old, so my grandparents, as I think for a lot of people, were people who, let's say, went through the war, went through the Holocaust. You had this direct connection to this European Jewish life, okay? My children won't have this, okay? All of that is foreign. All of that will be not only foreign, but also very difficult to explain. A culture has disappeared, a language has disappeared. I think that'll be very difficult, well nigh impossible. Now, I think the Jewish community right now is so deeply connected to the Holocaust, and in many ways very backward looking. I'll give you an example. So I just wrote a book. Often when a writer writes a book in North America, there's this thing called the Jewish Book Council. Okay, I don't know how many of you are familiar with this thing. Okay, here's what it means. On one day in May in New York, every Jewish person, or everybody who's written a book that has anything remotely Jewish in it, goes to New York, and you're given 2 minutes to pitch your book, literally, okay? And there's a woman, a very nice woman, stands and constantly gives you the time. You have okay, 2 minutes. You have 1 minute left, 30 seconds, right? In 2 minutes, you have to pitch your book. What percentage of those books are about the Holocaust? I don't know, 1,000%? And then another 1,000% are in Israel? Okay? How many of those books are about what's happening in America or Canada right now? Very small percentage. Okay? If you want to build a culture, if you want to retain a culture in this country, you better have something to say about it. You can't keep talking about Bobby, and you can't keep talking about, the 6-Day War. Now, how do you do that? That's a good question, if we believe it's worth doing. Okay? I look around this room. How many people in this room are under the age of 50? Just raise your hand.
This is good.
And this is considered good. I'm saying under 50, right? I didn't say under 40. If I say under 30, we're completely screwed. We have one who I know. Okay? So people who are here, let's say, are involved in, they go to the synagogue, they're involved in Jewish communal life, and I understand it. It's a point in your life where you have more time, you probably have more resources. I get that. Okay? But what about the future? Right? How do you think about your children or your grandchildren? What connection will they have? And what connection will be more than sort of like a nominal tribal connection? I don't know. When I think about what needs to be done for for perpetuation of Jewish culture in the diaspora, the only thing I can think about is education. Maybe that's because I have small children. And when I think about education for secular people, to my mind, I think it has to do with language. I'm somebody who speaks Hebrew because I'm a product of Jewish Hebrew Day School, which my parents were only able to afford, I think, A, because we were Soviet Jews, and B, because they had one child. I have 3 kids, I can't afford it. Okay? I tried, can't do it. So let's ask that question. And what kind of education is it for secular people? To my mind, having a common language. You talk about people meeting in Israel together, right, from all over the world. What language are they speaking? Are they all speaking English? If they are, that's kind of a travesty. What they should be doing when they meet is speaking Hebrew. Right? Jews have always had a common language. They've had multiple common languages. I think now we have, how many do we have now? The Haredim speak Yiddish still. Okay, we don't. English and Hebrew. I think the Jewish language now, the only recourse we have to it, realistically, is Hebrew. And I think we should be teaching Hebrew. For people who are not religious, which is most people, to have a connection to their Jewish history, to Jewish past, to be able to go to the land of the Jews and identify with them and converse with them in their own language, to hear the culture, to understand the music. To me, if I was in charge of North American Jewry, I'd say, okay, here's a bunch of money. Let's encourage Jews, let's make it enticing for them to send their children and learn the language and the history of the Jews. That's what I would do. I would give very little to Holocaust education, some, but I don't think it's a priority. I don't know how much money I would give to Israel. That country's, I think we need it more than they need it, frankly.
Okay. I'd like to ask a question about clarifying terms. Both of you use a word, Jewishness, and I wonder if we could define it. What is Jewishness? You also have both used a word, tribalism, the echoes of tribalism. If you could discern for us, what's Jewishness, what's tribalism, that would be helpful for our conversation tonight.
No, I was hoping you would go ahead, because if you can do this, you deserve much more than the Giller Prize. This is an ancient one. When I gave my sermon in Kol Nidre, the JTS has a service that's free and open to the public. So the Chancellor of JTS, even though I'm not a rabbi, I should say happily because I'm not a rabbi, you don't have to be a rabbi to give a sermon. So I started with a joke by Woody Allen, and then we talked about what makes it a Jewish joke. And then I talked about Freud's book on jokes and the relationship to the unconscious from 1905. Freud gave himself the luxury of, Freud tells dozens and dozens of Jewish jokes, right? For instance, there's a joke, the Ostjuden, the Jews from Eastern Europe, were said by the anti-Semites to be very dirty. So two Ostjuden meet outside a bathhouse, and one says to the other, "Oh, did you take a bath?" The other one says, "Why? Is one missing?" Now, see, it's a bad pun, but think about it. Think about what that's doing, right? Well, why would anyone throw into question that I took a bath, right? Am I going to succumb to this stereotype? Are we going to internalize this anti-Semitic stereotype? So if you're saying, did you take a bath, it must mean that one was missing, right? Okay, so I conclude from this that part of what Jewishness is we have a conversation with ourselves about the lives we're leading, which is both about the part of them that's distinctive because it's Jewish. So we're getting moved around from place to place. David's books are full of this. This is what Rabbi Soloveitchik called the covenant of fate. Anybody with their eyes open knows that Jews are affected by Jewish history, and there is a thing called Jewish history because people keep treating Jews differently. We're not the only people to be persecuted, but there's a particular story there. But then he said there's something else, which is this covenant of destiny. What are you going to pick? What do you want to be, right? And I think there's a commitment, which I saw all over the betrayers, to what I might call seriousness. Jews are committed to the fact that life is not a waste of time. There is something in this, whether you want to call it ethics, or that people matter, or you don't just say if the poor are poor, the hell with them, let them stay poor, they're meant to be poor, forget about them. There's something in us that can't stand the fact that the world doesn't make sense. How many religions are there, how many peoples are there that scream at God as much as we scream at God? It's really a Jewish trait, right? I love above almost all Jewish jokes about the one about the Jews who are debating whether God exists or not, and then one looks at his watch and says, "Oh, 3 o'clock, time to say mincha." And they daven mincha, and then go back to the debate about whether God exists or not. I love that. That's a very Jewish joke, right? I love the Jewish joke. I'm going on here with Jewish jokes because I'm trying to define what Jewish is, and one of the best ways you define what Jewish is look at Jewish jokes, right? You all know these. There's the guy who's drowning, and he prays to God to save him. And the raft comes along and he won't take it because he's waiting for God. And the helicopter flies overhead and lowers the ladder, but he won't take it because he's waiting for God. And the Navy destroyer comes up right beside him and wants to put him on board, but he won't take it because he's waiting for God. So he dies, he drowns, he goes to heaven. And God says, "Idiot, why didn't you let me save you? Right? I sent you the boat, I sent you the raft, I sent you the helicopter." Right? A very Jewish joke, because when we say the blessing over bread, Amoti lechem min haaretz, we know full well that it wasn't God who directly took the bread out of the earth, right? So why do we thank God for putting, we understand that there were people involved in this and there's a partnership between God and us. And so I think there's something Jewish in this clinging together and trying to build communities and knowing that history matters and knowing that you have real people and you can laugh at yourself and you can laugh at the world, but ultimately there's something in this. We're trying to do something serious. It's not ultimately a joke, which is why we laugh so much, to keep our sanity. And you can't define what Jewishness is, I don't think. But this constant attempt to keep our wits about us and preserve our footing and recognize that we're trying to do something in the world as somewhat of a distinctive people at the same time as we're trying to be part of and achieve in all of these civilizations. So yes, we want to have all these Nobel Prize winners and we want to be at the leading edge of every single culture, but we also want to have our place and our language and our people. And there's something, at the end of the day, quite distinctive about this, I think.
Fair enough. I would just say, two of the jokes you told are Jewish jokes, and one is like, could be anything. The one about, the waiting for the helicopter, I don't think that's a Jewish joke. I don't think there's anything distinctively Jewish about it. I think you could say that about, I don't know, Catholic faith or something. But anything about mincha, here's another one, okay? Here's a Jewish joke, one of my favorite, okay? So Abraham decides he's going to convert to Christianity, and he goes and converts. The next morning he wakes up, starts to lay tefillin. You know this one?
I think so.
Yeah. And he starts to lay tefillin. And Sarah comes and looks at him and goes, "Abraham, what have you done? Didn't you forget? You converted to Christianity. Ah, Goyischer Kopf. Okay? Right? You know why that's a Jewish joke? It requires two things. It requires the knowledge of a distinctive Jewish language, okay, Yiddish. If you're not Jewish, and certainly of a certain generation of Jews, you'll never get that. It requires the understanding of Ashkenazi Jewish life. It also requires the understanding of religion. Those three things. Okay, that's a Jewish joke. Now, if you don't have those things, those distinctive things, I don't think you have a culture. You could take away the religion part, okay, and still have a Jewish culture, because we did for a while. There was such a thing as the Bund, right? There was such a thing as Zionism, right? Where you could have Hebrew secular Jewish life. Now, the question always is, how long can that exist? Wonderful question. How long could Ashkenazi Yiddish Jewish life have existed and continue to exist in the lands of, Eastern Europe if the Holocaust didn't happen? Terrific question, right? The argument, the slur against the Bund by, I can't remember which communist it was, some Russian communist, he said, what were Bundists? Who knows this one? Bundists were Zionists with seasickness, right? Right? Okay, and the question is, how long could they have survived out there, retaining, a distinctive Jewish culture, based basically in the Yiddish language and Yiddish literature? I don't know how long, but longer than I think we'll survive here in English. So there has to be something distinctive. I wrote this essay that was up in Tablet that raised some of these questions that Yael was talking about, but it was based on the question about the continuation of Jewish American fiction, North American fiction. And what I was basing this on, in large part, was an essay by Irving Howe. And he said, okay, here are like the 5 or 6 things that make a culture distinctive and that enable a literature about it. Immigration, a language, a sense of place, family, right? These things that you could say are particularly Jewish. How many of those things can you strip away and still retain a sense of distinction? That you could have a literature about it, right? That's what I get at the Jewish Book Council, where they're pitching things either from the past or from someplace else.
I speak more knowledgeably about the United States and Canada, but I think it holds true here too, that our ancestors came to the United States and they figured out that the way to fit in was as one of the major religious groups. And we did this amazing thing so that by the 1950s, there's a famous book called Protestant, Catholic, Jew, right? As if there's as many Jews as there are Protestants and Catholics. Of course, the book is written by a Jew, Will Herbert. But nonetheless, we sold America, and I think Canada too, on this notion of a Judeo-Christian ethic. And in America, religion is constitutionally protected, whereas ethnicity, culture are not. And that matters a great deal. It's an enormous thing, the constitutional protection, that no one can take away the free exercise of religion, but the free exercise of culture has no constitutional protection. Right? So we were smart, except that we became part of the most secular part of American society, and now we're in this bind because we're defined as a religion, and religion in most people's heads, Jewish religion, is people who dress in black and have long side curls, and religion in general is Christian fundamentalists. And young people, not just young people, us, don't identify with that. So you have this Pew report which came out last year, the study of American Jews, right? You've heard of it, PEW report. And they have a category, Jew by religion, because they call you up on the phone and they say, what religion are you? And if you answer Jewish, you're a Jew by religion. And then they have a follow-up question, are you Jewish without being religious? But then they asked the Jews by religion, is your Jewishness primarily a matter of religion? And 3/4 of them said no. So I did this experiment myself. You can do it here tonight. We're in a synagogue, a conservative synagogue. I went to 3 conservative synagogues on Saturday morning where Jews are praying, right? And I asked the congregation, are you primarily religious as a Jew, or is your Jewishness based on ethnicity, culture, family, tradition? And again, 75% of the people in that room said ethnicity, family, culture. Right? Okay, show of hands. What percentage of you would say your Jewishness is mainly defined by religion? Right, so what? 15%, 20%, right? Because it's complicated. It's not a Jewish question in a certain way. It's an un-Jewish question. Like, why are we trying to divide up ourselves in this way? So, okay, so I was in Shul on Yom Kippur. I love Yom Kippur.
Can I just quickly interject as to why? Right? Because we're worried about it. Okay? I don't think you have the pew poll of Muslims in the United States in the same way.
We're going to someday soon.
Okay. But I think that's why. Because it's a concern. If it wasn't a concern, are you having, in Israel, are they having the same poll?
Yes.
Yeah? Interesting. Very interesting. Yeah.
And most Israelis are not going to define themselves as either Chinoni or Esdati. They're going to call themselves something in the middle, Masorati, which is what most of us, when we say the word tradition. But their tradition is much thicker than ours because they're defined by their surroundings. So they have Hebrew language, they have a calendar, they have war, they have all sorts of things that define them. And for American Jews, as you said before, David, the problem is Jewishness is very thin for most people. So there was a great teacher named Mordechai Kaplan who taught at JTS for 50 years. He's the founder of a school of Judaism called Reconstructionism, and he wrote his great book, and the title says it all, Judaism as a Civilization. He wanted us not to call Judaism a religion, but to call it a civilization. But he knew, and he said it himself, if you're living in America, your dominant civilization is going to be America. And Judaism is going to struggle for airtime, as it were. And that's where we all are. That's where we all are. So I don't know, we've got to find a way of giving a thickness to Jewish life that is in touch with this religion of ours, but doesn't get bogged down in people being repelled by the notion of religion because I don't want to be religious. I don't want to go on my sermon here, but my Kol Nidre sermon was all about the space that Judaism gives you for 101 different notions of what the divine is. It refuses to be nailed down. So Spinoza is Jewish, and Kabbalah is Jewish, and Maimonides is Jewish, and Mordechai Kaplan is Jewish, and the Lubavitcher Rebbe is Jewish, and Rav Kook is Jewish, and you go on like this. Because we recognize that we don't know very much about God. So the liturgy of Yom Kippur is all about God. So you walk into synagogue, you may think, this is all about God. And you don't know that they're directing you to introspection and to what's your purpose in life and all these other kinds of things. So we're the heirs to a language, a spiritual language is religious, and we have no other spiritual language in our culture. And right now, I think that really hurts us.
I think the spiritual element of Judaism is very important, even for people who are not, devout. I'm not devout, but we've been defined as a people by the spiritual, by the mystical Jewish tradition, and I think it's a rich tradition, a fascinating tradition. We should know more about it. But I think if we're asking contemporary North American Jews what makes them feel strongest as Jews, I think it's two things, the Holocaust and Israel, right? When people talk about what inspires the greatest amount of feeling, okay? Now, can you build a culture based on the Holocaust? I should certainly hope not. And can you build a culture based on Israel? Yeah, I think so. But how do you do it if you don't live in Israel? Okay, we're all here tonight. And the reason I'm here is not because I hope to sell some books, which, frankly, I do. But the reason I'm here is because I care about this stuff. And the reason I'm here to talk about it is that I hope that by talking about it, we're furthering a conversation to some end, to some point, okay? Because it matters to me whether we have a rich, vibrant Jewish culture. Because I would be very upset and feel quite lonely in some spiritual way if that wasn't the case. And if my children didn't have the opportunity to participate and feel deeply for the things that I felt deeply. Okay? So, we're here. Here's my platform. I'm not running for mayor. But here's my platform. If we're going to be serious about this, then let's be serious about it. Then let's think about the future and do something about it, okay? And we have to define the terms of what's our best chance to make it. I don't think it's religion, but I think the gateway to religion for a lot of people is going to be feeling a connection to the culture, and I think the best way to feel a connection to the culture is feel a connection to the language. And the only language remaining to my mind is Hebrew. And I think the only way to truly have a connection to Hebrew is to feel comfortable about Israel. That's it. And I think for that to happen, we also need to have a wide-ranging and candid conversation about what Israel is, as wide-ranging and candid a conversation as takes place in Israel, okay, which doesn't happen here. And it's not going to be easy, because it's not an easy conversation. But if we want to have some kind of future, to my mind, you need to have Hebrew. In order to have Hebrew, you need to feel connected to Israel. In order to feel connected to Israel, you have to be comfortable with that country. But also look at it, warts and all, and not be naive. And I think this is a moment in Israeli history that is a very pivotal and crucial moment. And I think we have to be serious about that too.
David, I think your platform is unusual for someone of our generation, putting an emphasis on Hebrew literacy and so on. That's something that we attribute to the generations before ours. And I wonder how much of that platform is informed by biography and your platform as well. Where does biography come in? Oh, and tell us about your last name.
Well, I'll do that at the very end. Biography, yeah, very simple. Very good answer. I speak Russian. I also learned Hebrew, but I speak Russian. I'm a Russian Jew. Okay? I'm not an ethnic Russian, but I know when I meet other Russian speakers, be they Jews or non-Jews, there's a different sort of evocation. There's a different level of connection. You feel yourself participating in something because of language. There's a level of identification. We express ourselves differently. In fact, we are somewhat different in another language. I know that with Hebrew as well, even though my Hebrew's degraded a lot. It was quite good when I was 14. I'm now 41. But I will say, when I go to Israel, I feel most at home. And the reason I feel most at home is because other than Arabic, which I regret I don't have, I have every other language, basically. So I can move through that country and basically feel like I understand everybody. A lot of Russian speakers, I can do that. My Hebrew's still good enough that I understand and can converse. I have some French. There are more and more French people in Israel, unfortunately. Not because I don't like French people, but because of the circumstances that bring them to Israel. And English. Oh my God, it's wonderful. Now, if I only spoke English and I went to Israel, I'd have a very different experience. So it all has to do with my biography and fundamentally with language.
If you need more water.
Yeah, I'm fine.
So I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the son of conservative Jewish parents who were born and raised in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And I got my Judaism, as it were, naturally because I lived on a street that had Jewish kids, Catholic kids, Protestant kids, and Ukrainian Eastern Orthodox kids. And so I discovered religious pluralism on the streets. And I discovered ethnicity because in the 1950s in Philadelphia, neighborhoods were ethnic. And my parents made a point of educating me, like, okay, now we're going into the Catholic neighborhood. And these are German Catholics, as opposed to these Catholics who are Irish Catholics. And those people are Protestants down there, and then et cetera, et cetera. And I realized that I fit in as a Jew, not despite my Judaism, but because of my Judaism. Because I had a religion and I had ethnicity. And so I don't know if Canada works the same way, but certainly the United States worked that way in the 50s and 60s. I felt American really deeply. And then I went to Oxford on a fellowship, and the 1973 war broke out, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by people who either didn't give a damn or were hostile to Israel. And I was astonished. I could not believe it. And I turned on the BBC, and every report was hostile to Israel, and I couldn't believe it. And so the Jews who cared and the Israelis met each other very, very quickly. Within 2 weeks of arriving at Oxford, I knew the Jews who cared, I knew the Israelis, and then next year, in my second year at Oxford, I made friends with Israelis who had been in the war. And then in 1975, I go to do a PhD at the Hebrew University, and forever afterwards, I'm marked. I feel a connection I don't quite understand, but I know that something is at risk. And I'm given an education in the history of modern Jewish thought, which tells me that there are two viable options for Jews in the modern world. One is the Zionist option, and one is the emancipation option, which we're living out here in modern Western diasporas, and they're both risky. And so forever afterward, my worldview is shaped by these facts of biography. We make Aliyah, my wife and I. We decide to come home for financial reasons. And so forever after, I'm going back and forth between Israel and the United States, and my mind is going back and forth, and I read Hebrew fluently, so I have that advantage and disadvantage. And I agree with David that when you read the Israeli conversation, particularly when you read it in Hebrew, you wish that that conversation could be transplanted here. And we're going to try to do our best at JTS this year to bring the Israeli conversation here, because we think it's very important that Jews in North America have the conversation that Jews in Israel are having, because they're having a very serious conversation about what the future of Jews and Judaism should be in the land of Israel in relationship to Palestinians and Muslims, etc. And that's a conversation I think we have to know about here as well. So here I am, because of this biography, having made Aliyah and come back, wake up at the age of 54 and say, I'm living a good life as a professor at Stanford University with an endowed chair. This is good. Palo Alto, California with an endowed chair at Stanford University. This is good, but it's not my issues. And so I decided to make my day job into worrying about preparing the next generation of leaders for the North American Jewish community, which I realized in my midlife crisis, is what I care about more than anything else. I want this community of ours to make it, and I think JTS does play an instrumental role in making that happen. And so it is great to hear a voice like David's write books like this, which are so full of, I don't know what to call it. We decided before there is a Jewish culture, there is a Jewish sensibility, of course there is a Jewish voice. And because it's me, you read a book like The Betrayers, I say, my God, I've never met this guy before, but I know him. And that's a pleasure. That's a real pleasure to be able to talk to people in shorthand. That's like Jewish geography.
Let me just say one thing about that, about having the conversation in Israel. So this book, The Betrayers, all the characters are Jewish. There are no Palestinians. In fact, I've been criticized, I don't think fairly, though I understand the criticism, that where's the Palestinian perspective? Where's the Arab perspective? Which I understand. I just don't think people are reading the book correctly. Never mind. But the conversation in Israel is not just about what are we going to do with the Palestinians, what are we going to do with the Muslims. No. There's also a conversation about what's happening between different derivations of Jews. Okay? I think that's the more important conversation. I think that's the decisive conversation for what's going to happen with the Palestinians and everybody else. It's what the Jews in Israel will decide amongst themselves. And I don't know how that's going to be resolved, because Israel's politics are very interesting and challenging because of the way that their political system is based, the type of democracy it is. But this book, The Betrayers, is really about, to me, fundamentally, Jews figuring out in Israel and outside of Israel, but predominantly in Israel, what's going to happen to this country. What's the direction of it? And you have the main character is a guy named Kotler, who was, a Soviet Jew, who was a refusenik, who was mostly a secular person, right? And 30 years ago, he was, the sort of person that people looked up to, heroic. His son is a Zionist Orthodox soldier. And the father and the son have a difference of opinion because of the direction and the demographic situation in Israel right now. Orthodox Zionism is a greater movement than it was 30 years ago. And what is going to happen because of the desires of the Orthodox Zionists is going to dictate what's going to happen to Israel. And for a lot of people who are not religious, who are secular Jews, will they be able to identify with that Israel if it becomes led by Orthodox Zionist Jews, which it very well may be, and also led by strongly nationalist Jews, a lot of who are former Soviet Jews, right? That's, in large part, that is what the book is about. That's why it deals very little with the Palestinians, but because I think the main conversation, the main conflict is, Internecine.
I had a a guy from Chabad visited my office last week. Now, many of you may be visited by people from Chabad all the time, and there may be Chabadnikim here even. But when you're the Chancellor of JTS, it's very unusual. And I told him, this is now my 8th year on the job, and you are the first ultra-Orthodox person who's ever come to see me as Chancellor of JTS, because Jews don't talk to each other across these lines, which is so sad. And I think we have to help the Israelis do a better job of talking to each other, but since we're here and not there, we have to do a better job of talking to each other across these lines here as well. We can't afford to let Haredim go off into a ghetto, especially with a larger and larger share of the Jewish population. This is just going to mess us up completely as a community. And I think we do have a lot to talk about, and not just history. So I think what you said is absolutely critical, and the dialogue in the book is so real, and it's precious because it's dialogue across these lines that these people may not talk to each other, but you've imagined their voices and you brought them in the book. And that's one of the reasons it was a pleasure to read.
Well, and it happens by virtue of the fact that it's within the same family. If it wasn't within the same family, it makes it much more difficult to cross those lines. It just so happens.
And that may save us as a people, that it's in the same family.
Thanks. It's said that a Jew is someone who can laugh with one eye and cry with the other, and you told Jewish jokes. We know that Jewish humor is part of that Jewishness, and also Jewish suffering is part of that Jewishness. So I wonder if part of our problem now, you use the adjectives of thick and thin identity. I wonder if part of our problem, why we're losing the thickness. So let's talk about it. Is privilege tripping us up?
Okay, well, as a Soviet Jew, I can tell you, as my mother and my aunt and my uncle are all here, and what I learned about being a Soviet Jew was, you became a Jew because nobody would let you forget, right? A lot of people would have preferred to forget. You had a passport and it had nationality. It was like the 5th classification of the 5th paragraph. Anyway, translating from Russian. And it had nationality. You're a Jew, you're Uzbeki, whatever. But it said you're a Jew, which is what does that mean? You're an ethnicity, it's a religion. You didn't have a choice. So there was persecution, there were quotas, all sorts of things. Yeah, that kept those people together. Now, yeah, absolutely. What's wonderful about North America, what's wonderful about Canada and the United States, I agree. I don't think we've, as a people, have ever enjoyed such privilege. And it comes with a cost. And the cost is it's only a cost if we believe it's a cost. If you don't care, then it's fine. Let everybody intermarry, let everybody assimilate, and it's fine. Nobody's going to get hurt. Okay? Now, if you believe that is a loss, if you personally believe it's a loss, then you have to do something about it. Right? And what can you do about it? And again, I keep circling back to the same thing. You have to look forward. You need something distinctive. Right? But it takes work because nobody's doing the work for you. You have to do the work yourself. And as with anything, like I have small children, trying to get them to do things they don't want to do, it's like, okay, work is hard. It's not easy. It's easy to blend in. We're lucky. All of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation where it's easy to blend in. Go pick out a Jew. Okay, you're not black, you're not Asian. If you want to blend in, you can pretty much blend in. So it's going to take some work. And I think the odds are most people are lazy. And so you have to make it attractive to them. If it's, as with children, if you say you have to do this, it's a chore, I'm going to give you a sticker, then you get this. Basically that's how a lot of communal life is. If you do this, you get some kind of reward, get to feel good about yourself. But I think ultimately that's not going to, you can't build a culture on that. You have to do the work. And you have to understand what the work is. And everybody will define that in different ways. For some people it's Jewish religion, which is great. Again, I don't think that's going to be the answer for most people. So you have to figure out what it's going to be.
So I don't want to bet my future on anti-Semitism. I'm afraid that if anti-Semitism comes along in a big way in the United States and Canada, it may draw some Jews closer. It's going to push other Jews farther away. I don't think it's going to gain, and God forbid we should depend on a renaissance of anti-Semitism to make the Jews Jewish. So we're going to have to find other things. And one difference between us, and I trace the biography, is I was raised by a father who was very pious, not in a punctilious, observant kind of way, but in his heart. I mean, he was grateful to God to be alive. Not just grateful to be alive, but grateful to God to be alive. And he said that every morning, and he transmitted that to me. And my mother was pious, again, in a very old-fashioned kind of way, but not in a, okay, you know, we would go to synagogue on Saturday morning and go out for lunch afterwards. That was our conservative Judaism growing up. But synagogue was the center of our lives. And as a result of this, and then becoming a scholar and studying modern Judaism, I find this division between religion and secular really problematic. Really problematic. Religion is something that, it's a label. Now, I'm not trying to put everybody in my camp and saying, David, you're really religious even if you don't know it. No, that's imperialist and that's obnoxious, and I wouldn't do that. And the same reason I don't want people who tell me, well, you're not Orthodox and so you're really secular, you know. I resent that. But there's something in us that wants to be part of something larger than ourselves, and it has a sense that there's other forces in this world than those we understand, and wants to connect with them. And I really do think there's a primary impulse of this sort, and people express it in a variety of ways, and I don't want to shortchange this part of our tradition. So you look at what this tradition of ours has given the world and still gives the world. I mean, I'm sitting in a JTS lunch, and we're honoring a lawyer, and his Mormon partner is there, and his Mormon partner leans over to me and says, oh, what are you doing at your Seder this year? Because, you know, we're having a Passover Seder, and I'm looking for ideas. Mormons are having Passover Seders. Right? It's common in America now, I don't know if in Canada as well, for Christians to have Passover Seders. The holiday of Passover is so fantastic a thing that non-Jews don't feel like we should have a monopoly on it. You know how many people get married under a chuppah now, with a ketubah? Not intermarriages, Christian Jewish, but marriages, because we have these rituals that are fantastic. I don't know if you all read this new book about Eichmann, with Eichmann's diaries. I don't know about you, but to hear Adolf Eichmann talk gave me a new appreciation of monotheism. Because when Adolf Eichmann talks, honestly, and says that my race is primary. He doesn't use the word, but my race is God. And anything I can do, or anything I have to do to further my race, I am allowed to do, without any restraint whatsoever. I understood idolatry. I understood what idolatry was all about. And we've given the world this gift, and we're still giving the world all sorts of gifts. And so I think we've got something really precious here, and it has borne a religious label, and we haven't figured out a way outside of Israel to connect the religious piece with the larger cultural piece in a satisfactory way. And so I want to, this is one of the reasons I love JTS, because we try to take up this challenge. Yeah, we take religion seriously, but we also take the rest of Jewish culture seriously, certainly Hebrew language, certainly ethics, music, arts, literature. And we want to bring the two together. And if we're assigning ourselves a task, I second David's motion, that we have to figure out a model now that's going to appeal to Jews, where we can say to them, okay, be Jewish. Those of you who want to come to synagogue Saturday morning, this is great. But let's find Sabbath activities. I think it's important it be Sabbath, because we need a space and time set aside for us, and not just once a year. So we need a regular space and time set aside for us, and let's find something to do that's not strictly religious, in quotation marks. And that would be a really important thing for this generation of Jews to develop. If I were Federation, I'd put money there.
There is another development, and the Pew study shows it, that there are among the next generation people who are actually only interested in Judaism as a spiritual pursuit. And especially with the heartbreak in Israel/Palestine, there are some young Jews who are just saying, I don't want any part of that conversation. I can't handle it. I'd rather be a universalist than a Jewish particularist, but I love Judaism. So what do you do with those folks? They're really the inverse of the person that you describe.
I don't know what percentage of people that's going to be. Maybe it's, as you say, a small number will survive. I don't think that's the majority of people. But I think that's fine. That's wonderful. And if the short answer is what you were talking about, there has to be something positive. You should be proud. Find something to be proud in about Judaism, right? If you want to give something to the next generation, don't do it out of fear or out of guilt. Do it out of pride. So know your culture, know your traditions, be proud of it, and then you can do it. And if that's if you're informed about Judaism and spirituality, great. If it's Jewish language and literature, great. But it has to be something, and it has to be forward-looking. I have no problem with any of that. I think that's great. What bothers me is to go back to tribalism. It's a level of ignorance. Most people who know very little about their tradition, don't speak the language, and yet have very strong opinions about being Jews. It doesn't have to be just Jews. It's any culture. Ignorance is the worst thing, and entitled ignorance is usually what happens, and it's toxic. So I hope we don't build an entire culture on that, which are Jews who know very little about themselves and their history, but feel very strongly about being Jewish, and they're going to do a lot of damage. And I want no part of that.
The Pew report was pretty depressing in many respects, and this was one of them. So they asked people, are you proud to be Jewish? And the famous finding was that 94% of the people they spoke to were proud to be Jewish. Great. But then they asked them what they know. It turns out they know next to nothing. So the only two things that scored above 50% on the question about what do you have to do to be a Jew, number one is you have to remember the Holocaust. That was by far the highest. And number two was you have to care about social justice, philanthropy. They didn't say the word tzedakah, but okay. Israel is way down. God, religion, everything else is way down.
I think Jewish humor was higher.
Jewish humor was higher. Now, this is a positive. I like that. That's good. We did a survey in my book, The Jew Within, with sociologist Steve Cohen. The data was from 1997. How much do you care about Israel? And these findings have been repeated in every survey since. So the percentage of Jews who say they care a lot about Israel is less than 30%. Consistently. Except at a time of war, it may go up to like a third, and then it'll immediately come down again. The percentage of Jews who say they don't care at all about Israel is like a third. Don't care at all about Israel. And that makes sense when you think of the fact that less than 50% of American Jews belong to anything. 25% of American Jews, from the time they're born to the time they die, will never do anything Jewish. They're totally disconnected. So that figure of 33%, who don't care about Israel at all, is not so surprising. Everybody else says they care about Israel somewhat. If I were AIPAC, I'd be very concerned about these numbers. Because if you think the future of Israel depends to some extent on American government support, Canadian, British, other government support, and this is the percentage of American Jews that care deeply about Israel, this is worrisome, right? But it's worrisome on another level because what I have to say to these young Jews is, okay, I want to encourage Jews to go through any door they can. So and I know people like the ones you're describing, you know them well, I know them well. Fine, if your thing is not going to be Israel, do whatever Jewish thing you're doing. And I think, though, you get into it more, you discover there's something called history which claims you. Jewish history claims you. Particularly if you're going to say you have to know about the Holocaust to be Jewish. What does that mean? You remember that between 1939 and 1945, something happened over there in Europe. Is that what it means to remember the Holocaust? Or does it mean that there's something in Jewish history that goes on, that led up to the Holocaust, that follows out of it, and that somehow Israel is implicated in this Jewish history of ours? And so I don't think the attitude of being a spiritual Jew with no connection to the Jewish people is going to be very long-lasting. I don't think that has legs to it. People may think it does, but I don't think there's legs to it. I don't think it's going to be there.